Steve Barclay to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Sir Roger. And in moving the motion, can I begin by saying it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I have secured this debate to highlight concerns about the operational performance of the Environment Agency in the east of England. And this reflects both my time as the Secretary of State oversighting that department in the run-up to the general election, and also numerous interactions with them in my constituency capacity. Now, as we are meeting the week before a comprehensive spending review, it's perhaps prudent to start with the usual excuse given by organisations for poor operational performance, and that is usually a lack of people or a lack of funding. Now, according to the Environment Agency's own annual accounts, the EA's full-time equivalent staff increased in the last Parliament by 21%, from 10,791 in 29-20 at the start of the Parliament to over 13,000 in 23-24. And over the same period, their expenditure has gone up from 1.4 billion to 2.2 billion. So they've had significantly more people, more funding, at the same time as showing a remarkable lack of transparency or accountability to ministers or members of Parliament, and a remarkable lack of willingness to take enforcement action against those causing the worst levels of environmental damage. Of course I give way.
Shannon.
The Honourable Chairman, it's an absolute scandal that it seems to be, Sir Roger, that the Environment Agency, the EA, seem to be happy to pursue farmers and landowners with a zest and an enthusiasm, and yet no big business or other people seem to be left to the side. Is it not time that the Environment Agency should be supporting farmers, helping them at a time whenever they need help, rather than chasing them and not chasing others?
Steve Barclay.
Well, he raises an extremely important point, and he's correct. What it seems that the Environment Agency is very happy to go after what it may perceive to be easier, more law-abiding targets. And because we know that often the most serious environmental harm is caused by serious criminal gangs, there's often a reluctance to take those organisations on in the way that they are an individual farmer. And that's why I think it also points, which I'll come on to, for a need for much more fundamental reform in terms of the department's relationship with its arm's length bodies, and indeed the accountability to ministers, regardless of which government is in office. Now, this debate is focused specifically, Sir Roger, on the east of England. And I want to give three examples of where that operational performance really illustrates across the board concerns with environmental damage being caused. But before doing so, I thought, given I had been the Secretary of State, it is relevant to touch on a national example to show this isn't simply a constituency or a local issue. With that in mind, for example, let me inform the House about Hawes Wood, which is a site of special scientific interest, what's called a SSSI in Kent, an area of outstanding natural beauty, which has been covered, as you probably know, Sir Roger, in over 35,000 tonnes of illegal waste. Now, you would have thought a SSSI was a priority case for the Environment Agency, the ones where they would be most certain to be taking action. But so concerned was I, as a minister, that I had to issue the very unusual step of a ministerial direction. Now, no ministerial direction had been issued in the department in the preceding 7 years before I arrived as Secretary of State. So this was an unusual step, but was necessary to compel the EA to take action on a SSSI. And that, again, I think speaks to some of the issues. And even then, the situation has dragged on, with contractors not appointed until November last year, work not beginning until March, and completion, Sir Roger, not expected until at least 2026. So that points to some of the issues with the most valuable sites, never mind more routine sites. Of course I could wait.
I'll give another example from Kent, in Tunbridge Wells, in my constituency. The River Grom often has very high levels of ammonia due to sewage being dumped in the river. And when this is reported to the Environment Agency, they claim lack of funds, don't send their own investigators, and often pass it across to Southern Water, who are perhaps to blame for the original problem in the first place. So doesn't this contribute to a sort of lack of democratic oversight of our environment?
Barclay.
Well, he absolutely catches the point, as indeed was raised earlier, this lack of accountability, this lack of transparency, but also the fact that the EA has had more money, has had more resource, And it's not even targeting priority cases, as he highlights, as well as other issues that have been long-standing, whilst often telling members of Parliament, indeed, that these are priority cases, as I will come on to. So there's a wider issue which the Minister needs to be aware of in terms of this slowness to act and lack of accountability. But turning now to the East of England and my own constituency in particular, let me give 3 examples covering a range of scenarios. So the first is the dumping of over 122,000 tonnes of waste at Saxon Pit in Whittlesey. Now, that occurred between October 2017 and February 2018. And the EA's initial response was to say they'd been totally unaware of 122,000 tonnes of waste being dumped. But regardless of whether they were asleep at the wheel, you would expect them then to act. And indeed, in their initial response, they said that they expected all the non-conforming waste, that the operator must dispose of it by October the 10th, 2018. And yet 7 years on, the waste remains in situ. Now, they also promised, in addition, prosecutions, because this was such a serious case. Indeed, if I take just one of many letters that I have had and interchanges with the interplays with the EA over this period. In April 2021, the then Chief Executive, Sir James Bowen, promised, and I quote, "Saxon Pit is being treated as a priority." Now, their investigation took a further 14 months to complete, but then in June 2022, the EA was saying a final set of interviews will take place shortly. Then in October 22, they were saying, "Be assured that my teams are prioritising this work over other competing criminal inquiries." So back 3 years ago, Sir Roger, they were saying they were prioritising this serious case with over 122,000 tonnes of waste over other cases. It was a priority case for them. And yet 3 years on, 7 years on from the issue, we still have no prosecutions. So as the Honourable Gentleman said a moment ago, what cases are they prosecuting with this additional resource if they're not prosecuting at Saxon Pit? But then I thought, well, the Minister might reflect, well, perhaps this was simply an issue of the past government. Perhaps things have changed. The Environment Agency perhaps has changed its approach. So I thought it might be helpful to give us a second example, one from the last year. And that relates to a very serious pollution incident at King's Dyke in the same town of Whittlesey as Saxon Pit. Now, internal papers from the Environment Agency that I've seen show that they describe this, and indeed reported to the department, that they believe this was a Category 1 pollution incident. Now, for those not familiar with that, a Category 1 pollution incident is the most severe level of pollution. It is serious, extensive or persistent impact on the environment, people or property. And indeed, the BBC reported, alongside an estimated 900 fish being killed in close vicinity to an angling water overflow pipe, that pipe had discharged for 23 hours due to a suspected pump failure. And indeed, when I spoke to Angling Water and I spoke to the Environment Agency, no other credible reason for this serious incident was given. And indeed, I was then told that water samples had been taken and it would be quick to establish if indeed this overflow pipe was the cause of this Category 1 incident. That was expected. I was told on the 10th of October 2024 that the lab tests were underway, that it'd take a week for those to determine the cause, and that an internal decision would be taken on enforcement in November. Now, November then became December. December then became January. And we kept chasing up every time. Then we were told, no, it's no longer January, it's May. So we chase up again in May, then we get to May, we're now told September. So on something that ministers, and I don't doubt for a minute the sincerity, but ministers say is an absolute government priority, we have the most serious level of pollution incident, a Category 1, and yet the Environment Agency is saying that happens in September, but we will not tell the public of Whittlesey what the cause of that is for at least a year. Even though I suspect internally, and indeed the department probably knows, whether indeed Angling Water was the cause of that, and whether, therefore, a criminal investigation should follow. And I don't believe that is a sufficient level of transparency or accountability. Let me give a third example, and again, as a former minister, I thought I'd try and sort of pitch these examples in a way that is constructive across the House. And one of the debates which the Minister may recall, which was led by one of her parliamentary colleagues, the member for Stoke-on-Trent, who raised the cross-party concerns. Indeed, there were a number of her colleagues in the House. It wasn't herself, it was one of her ministerial colleagues representing the front bench. But this was a debate organised by the member for Stoke-on-Trent, who raised concerns around the environmental damage of incinerators. And indeed, this is something that many charities, usually more closely aligned with the left of politics, have raised concerns, the likes of Friends of the Earth. It is something many on the government's own benches have raised concerns. It's something I have consistently raised concerns myself about. And DEFRA's own analysis, we now know, suggests there is enough national capacity for incineration. As more waste is recycled, the requirements on incineration come down. And indeed, again, a BBC report highlighted the serious damage that is caused from these incinerators. Indeed, waste being burned because of anaerobic digesters, most of that now is plastic, and it is the dirtiest way to generate power. Not something one would have thought a government committed to the environment would be wanting to see more incinerations built. Indeed, it is on a par with coal in terms of being the dirtiest form of energy generation. Yet we still don't have clarity from the government in terms of whether environmental permits will remain in force where incinerators haven't been built. And one of those is in Wisbech. And again, just to remind you, Sir Roger, to put this in context, this is an incinerator so big that one half the size in the neighbouring constituency was turned down. So they doubled it in size in order to make it a national scheme and take it outside local planning. It is sited 700 metres from the largest school in the district, accessed solely by single carriageway roads, with a chimney that is bigger than Ely Cathedral in the flat landscape of the Fens. And the Environment Agency, in issuing a permit, say they don't consider any of the environmental harm from taking waste from 6 different counties to transport it to this small market town, because their permit only applies to the curtilage of the site itself. I simply ask, given the cross-party support, whether that decision by the Environment Agency is fit for purpose. And I will add one further point, Sir Roger. Isn't it very odd that the decision to grant it an environmental permit was granted during the general election purdah period, a time when organisations are not supposed to take controversial decisions? It is something I hope the Minister will follow up, because I know many of her own government colleagues are concerned where incinerators haven't been built, we should not be embedding the environmental damage that so many charities, so many environmental groups and so many of our own colleagues have expressed concerns about. Of course, I agree.
Thank you very much for giving way. The member represents North East Cambridgeshire. I'm South West Norfolk. We share a border, very similar geography, and I recognise many of the concerns he raises about pollution. But he mentions permits. I wonder if he shares my concerns about the performance of the EA in relation to the time taken to issue permits, licences, other permissions. In our part of the world, a real barrier to growth and prosperity for businesses, because the performance is so poor, months, if not years, for businesses to get approvals from the EA. Does he share those concerns?
I do share. So firstly, his own constituency, just for the benefit of the Minister, will be materially affected in terms of the transport, because what the developer did was double its size to take it out of planning, but they then created a different problem, which is how do you get sufficient capacity of waste in order to run it? And therefore you have to take the waste from further and further afield. But because it's a market town accessed by single carriageway roads, the A47 is single carriageway into Wisbech, going through my neighbour's constituency will cause huge traffic in that constituency, as it will do in many others across the eastern region. But it's also, and I point, for example, to the BBC report that points to the severe environmental damage that would be caused by this. But he also highlights a wider point, which is just a lack of transparency often. And as in the case with the King's Dyke fishing example, one chases as a constituency MP on behalf of constituents to give them some answers. and yet organisations feel they're unaccountable. And that really brings me on to my final point, because as it won't surprise the Minister, as a member of the last government, I quite frequently raise my constituency concerns. This was before I was in the Department of DEFRA, with relevant Secretaries of State, and I know that they, as Secretaries of State, raised those with the EA, and yet, as we can see, for example, with Saxon Pit, they have still failed to take prosecution action over 7 years, while saying to people locally, it is a priority case. As Secretary of State myself, I found the organisation so unresponsive, I had to take the unusual step of issuing a ministerial direction. In fact, I issued 2 in my 6 months in the department when none had been issued in the 7 years before. And so I fear ministers now, need to come, and I'll come on to this as a final point, look at the accountability, not just of the Environment Agency, but Natural England, in terms of democratic control, not least given the 3 interventions we've already had from colleagues across the House, across Ecuador.
I thank the right honourable friend for giving way. I've got an issue in my constituency down White Stubbs Lane where we've got raw sewage going over the road, and the Environment Agency are just so unaccountable, hardly wants to meet with MPs, hardly wants to engage, and told me during the Purdah period, we can't meet with you because there's a local election going on, which is absolute nonsense. They should engage with MPs. And does he agree with me they're completely unaccountable and need fundamental reform and change?
Well, I think they do need fundamental reform. Obviously, when I became Secretary, it was very close to the general election, although one of the first acts I did was issue an instruction in terms of taking more rigorous enforcement action more generally in terms of water pollution. And I know ministers, current ministers, want to see a more robust set of actions there. And so I come really to my final point, which is, I think, not least given the majority the government has and where we are in the parliamentary cycle, there is an opportunity to look at the department's relationship with its arm's-length bodies. If you look at the Department of Health and Social Care, they are going through that exact process in terms of Natural England. And so, firstly, if I could encourage the ministerial team to reflect on that, not least when in some years' time they're explaining if there is lack of action, how that sits with some of the priorities that they have set. But irrespective of that, I think as we've seen from the interventions from across the House, the lack of transparency and accountability of the EA in terms of their operational performance needs to be addressed. And if I could encourage the Minister to focus some time in her busy schedule in doing so. Thank you very much.